Levels of understanding for the human visual experience. 1. Naive realism, aka direct realism, level. When we were young and naive, we looked out at the world and assumed that the visual experience we were seeing was what the external world actually looked like. We did not think deeper about what this visual experience actually could be. It was so simple then. We just looked out into the world and thought we saw the world as it was. As we examined our visual experiences, we could see that the different objects out there had different colors. We thought that the colors were a direct property of the things that we were looking at. At this level, we thought our visual experience was painted with all the different colors of all the objects that are out there. 2. Physical light level. Most technical-minded people were eventually driven to ask a question. How does this visual experience actually happen? It all seemed so simple when we were at the naive realism level. But we have learned, matured, and began questioning things. We took some science courses and found out that we do not directly see objects in the world, but rather we see the reflected light from these objects. This was a fantastic new realization. Now, when we observed our visual experience, we could understand that we were merely seeing reflected light from objects in the external world. We realized that our visual experience was now painted with all the possible physical light, electromagnetic, wavelengths that our eye could detect. From this perspective, we thought we were seeing the actual physical light that was hitting the retina. We thought that the colors were a direct property of the electromagnetic physical light that we were looking at. We were closer to reality because at least we now understood that we were not seeing the actual objects anymore. 3. Neural light level. Even though we thought it was the physical light, most technical-minded people were eventually driven to ask a question. How does this visual physical light experience actually happen? It all seemed so simple when we were at the physical light level, but we continued to learn more. We took some courses in eye physiology and brain physiology, which made us realize that we do not directly see the physical light that seemed to make up our visual experience. The eye is a converter that receives physical light and generates neural activity that is correlated with the physical light. We found out that the visual experience that we see requires neural activity. We learned that there was no visual experience without neural activity. Three, neural light level. Even though we thought it was the physical light, most technical-minded people were eventually driven to ask a question. How does this visual physical light experience actually happen? It all seemed so simple when we were at the physical light level, but we continued to learn more. We took some courses in eye physiology and brain physiology, which made us realize that we do not directly see the physical light that seemed to make up our visual experience. The eye is a converter that receives physical light and generates neural activity that is correlated with the physical light. We found out that the visual experience that we see requires neural activity. We learned that there was no visual experience without neural activity. This was again a fantastic new realization. From this perspective, we thought we were seeing the effect of our own internal neurons firing. We were closer to reality because at least we now understood that we were not seeing the actual physical light anymore. Our visual experience was still painted with all the colors that we have always seen, but we now knew that these colors were generated internally by our brains, and we understood that all these colors were never something that was external. The colors became properties of neural activity. The light was now understood to be something inside of us. 4. Conscious light level. When we were at the naive realism level, it made sense that our visual experience was actually showing us what the external world looked like. When we were at the physical light level, it made sense that our visual experience was actually showing us what the physical light looked like. But when we attained the neural light level, there was not that same feeling of it making sense. In fact, it made no sense that the neural activity produced the beautiful panoramic color visual experience that we all have. Where, after all, were all those colors coming from inside the neurons? How could neurons firing have a property of color? There was a problem here because we could not find any courses to take that would answer this latest question. Science had effectively hit a brick wall on this question. There was an explanatory gap at the neural light level. It was clear that our visual experience was still that panoramic, color-filled experience that we always had. The light was still there, being generated by the brain in some way. But there was no chain of logic that could take us from neurons firing to the visual light experience. It became an item of faith that science would figure out what the required chain of logic would be. Science has tried for 100 years to figure this out, but there is nothing to show for the effort. Maybe the reason science cannot find the visual light experience in the neurons is because it is not in the neurons. From a systems engineering and signal processing perspective, all we know is that neural activity happens and then a visual light experience happens. It seems like the visual light experience is a further processing stage after the neural processing. It was so simple when we were at the neural light level, but we have learned more, matured more, and began thinking deeper about the visual experience. Even though we thought it was the neurons doing it, most technical-minded people were eventually driven to ask the question, how does this visual light experience actually happen from the neural activity? It became clear that new ways of thinking about the problem needed to be developed. This is what science is supposed to do. This is how science progresses. Instead, a lot of scientists are still trying to push the visual light experience back into the neurons, but the visual light experience refuses to be pushed into the neurons. The visual light experience seems to be something separate from the neurons, even though we know it is probably connected to the neural activity in some way. The visual light experience simply hovers and is embedded in the front of our faces, as will be explained and demonstrated later. We sense that it must be some kind of conscious experience concept that happens in some kind of conscious mind concept, but we cannot know that for sure. It just seems to be our best engineering and scientific speculation for progressing forward. It is a hypothesis which must be proved or disproved with proper experiments, as will be explained. It will be shown that what we are seeing is what I call our own internal conscious light. The concept of conscious light will be fully developed and explained in the sections that follow. For now, it can be said that we have never seen an actual object out in the world, nor do we see the actual reflected light from an object, nor do we see actual neural activity. Instead, we have always only seen our own internal conscious light. This conscious light is correlated with the electromagnetic light, which fools us into thinking we are seeing the electromagnetic light. But the electromagnetic light is just a phenomenon out in the physical world, and it looks like nothing. What we see is the conscious light that is generated by our internal brain/mind mechanism, and the InterMind website is devoted to pushing the boundaries of what can be known at the conscious light level of understanding.